ASUS, in its infinite wisdom, has made this $2,500 pre-built computer, which absolutely guts the CPU performance by downclocking it over 1.3 gigahertz below what it's supposed to be operating at. In actually what is the worst version of a pre-built that we have ever reviewed. So this is the ASUS G22CH-DH978. And what this tiny ROG pre-built lacks in performance, competent component selection, thermals, value, and basically everything else, it makes up for with that name. They've basically downclocked it back to the 9th generation of Intel. And in doing so, have managed in an impressive way to make the worst pre-built, because even the Origin system that we looked at, which was a 1 gigahertz underclock on AMD, was doing better than this thing. This is a 14900 KF, and they've got it running at i7 13700K levels of performance. It's really bad. But they do have the "Don't Eat Batteries" sticker on it. This computer is from ASUS's self-branded Republic of Gamers, and it spends all of its overhead on the largest "Don't Eat Batteries" warning we've ever seen. So this appears to have been made by the Republic of the lawyers. ASUS gets its own computer's dimensions wrong. The retail page calls the side panel tempered glass despite it being plastic, and it says the design doesn't use screws, but it does, and the system is a clown car of component and power choices with its DDR5 4800 RAM and its limited power budget for Intel. It's got a custom-sized closed-loop liquid cooler, ensuring you can never maintain it, in the top under a quick-release panel. We picked up this tiny system at Micro Center for $2,500. It is not cheap. It is, to their credit, relatively smaller. There's another ingestion hazard warning on there. So I guess that is where all the money went. Anyway, we're going to be testing this today. We ran it through our thermals, acoustics, everything else. Short version is, worst pre-built we've ever tested, including, by the way, the $6,600 Origin PC and Alienware. It doesn't get the "it's better than Dell" award. It's actually worse. It's really impressive. Before that, this video is brought to you by Height and the Y70 case. The Height Y70 case has a lot of polish and heavy attention to detail on the finer points. The case can fit radiators that are massive in depth to the side mount, has cooling in the floor of the case for direct intake to the GPU, and tries to find a balance between structural support of dust filters without obstructing too much intake. The Y70 is a follow-up to the popular Y60, which got Height to where it is today with its cut-corner tempered glass cases. So our last pre-built review was the Thermal Take 1. That was a system where, in the review setup, I said, we specifically went hunting to try and find good pre-builds because there have been so many bad ones lately. And the Thermal Take 1 was good. We liked it overall. This was one of the ones we bought in that sequence of trying to find something good. And the only reason we thought it might be good is because the form factor is so rare for a pre-built, and it had every possibility to perform okay. But then ASUS came along and they ASUS'd all over it, and we have what we have. Here's what ASUS's marketing says about this computer. Quote, condensed size, concentrated power, compact with an impact, and do more with less. Now, they're not lying here because they're probably talking about doing more with the less performance because they can't configure it properly. Now, despite the focus here, ASUS's dimensions for this PC are a flat-out lie. They are completely incorrect. And that's the easiest thing to get right since it is literally just measuring the outside of the computer. The company claims the G22CH measures at 323 by 115 by 287 millimeters and is 10 liters, they say, in volume. First of all, that's 10.6 liters, not 10 liters, and 10.6 doesn't round to 10. Secondly, it's also wrong because the PC actually measures at 324 by 123 by 292 millimeters. That's a volume of 11.6 liters, which is way different than 10.0. Fortunately, it doesn't matter because you shouldn't buy it anyway. Moving past that, cooling for the CPU is handled by a custom dual 92mm liquid cooler in the top, underneath a quick release panel. There's also an air-cooled version, but that's not what we're covering today because this computer already doesn't need any help incinerating its CPU, and we certainly don't want to do that with air. The ASUS Prebuilt also comes with this. An exquisite alternate side panel, which is described as tempered glass on the Micro Center website, and as you can see, that is not glass. That is plastic. Now, despite being easy to see through the bullshit, it is hard to see through the tinted panel. But one of the things we can see on it is the definition of what ASUS calls the subgenre of science fiction cyberpunk. Just printed right there. Why? Don't ask questions. Here's what it says. Quote, cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction that features advanced science and technology in an urban future. Cyber represents the extreme technology of ROG, while punk represents a culture with attitude and distinct style. ROG aims to bring our users to the new future by building our brand around cyberpunk, all caps, period, end quote. Nothing says punk quite like a multi-billion-dollar corporation using the technicals of a dictionary to define culture. One last thing to mention here is that ASUS mentions the PC being a tool-free design, saying, quote, you're able to get into the internals quickly without turning a single screw. There is, however, a single screw that the user does, in fact, have to turn in order to remove the panel and take the top off for the first time. Good, that's great. ASUS has really improved this year. Just make everything up. Then you don't need to hire marketing. You just put whatever you want on the box. Let's get into something that ASUS is actually a master of, which is pricing. This is the part and price breakdown of the G22CH-DH978, the variant we bought. We used identical parts where possible when building a DIY list, but the ASUS system has a lot of proprietary bullshit, so we picked the closest stuff that made sense for price and kept the general spirit of the build alive. ASUS ends up with a premium of around $850 to $875 over DIY, depending on day-to-day price fluctuations. It's not as bad as the Corsair i500, but it's still way beyond what's reasonable, and it's insulting considering the shortcomings of functionality, turning the 14900K into a lower spec part. In this situation, they're using non-standard parts in a situation where industry standard would work just fine. So the end result is you get a system that is not using mini ITX or micro ATX, kills the future upgradability of the system, has a strange cooler solution that will be difficult to replace when it dies. And further, flex ATX power supplies are available for this form factor. They're just a little more rare in DIY, but they're available, and ASUS could use its ASUS-ness to acquire them to get this a little more standard. So that would have been nice to see. But then again, it would have been nice to see a 14900K running at the spec it's supposed to run at. Either way, we take less issue with the custom-sized cooler because it is matched to the case. It's just that when it eventually dies for some number of users, it's going to be pretty hard to replace, at least like for like. But the worst part of the raw spec sheet is the DDR5 4800, which is abysmally slow and will hamper overall performance. You're paying over $800 extra for the privilege of bottom-tier launch spec DDR5 from 2021. The price difference is negligible for a 32GB kit. 4800 starts around $70 DIY. 5600 is like $75. 6000 can be bought for $80. These aren't the best kits. All of them, however, are better than what ASUS has chosen, and it's basically the same price. And none of that is even the bad part. We're getting there now. The bad part is the CPU. So, we're going to look at the CPU performance. Let's just get it over with. Here's the frequency chart comparing the 14900KF in the ASUS computer to frequency data for the 14900K from our original review. Average P-core frequency is 855 megahertz below the spec at PL2, and a staggering, actually unbelievable 1,330 megahertz down at PL1. This actually reduces a 14900K to under 4 gigahertz, which is crazy. The Intel 2700K boosted to 3.9 gigahertz, the same speed 13 years ago in 2011. Now, architecturally, these are pretty different, so we can look to the 14900K's familial heritage in the $70 i3-12100F, which boosts to 4.3 gigahertz. E-cores don't fare much better, also falling behind by over 1 gigahertz relative to stock. This is insane. This is the worst setup we have ever seen. This chart shows that the system is clearly set up for the CPU to actually apply tau, or the PL2 duration limit. It exhibits different frequency behavior over time, dropping off a small cliff just after the 80-second mark. The P-core average plummets below the stock E-core average frequency. It's actually disastrously bad. It'd be hilarious if people didn't actually buy this thing. It's all a direct result of ASUS slashing the power budget of the 14900KF to about 125 watts, or half of what it should be. This has a huge and negative impact on multi-threaded performance. This chart shows the completion time of our standard Blender rendering benchmark, where we render a 3D image. The properly configured 14900K completed the task in 8.5 minutes, while ASUS's configuration of the same CPU required almost 11 minutes. The stock result reduces the time requirement to complete the render by 22%. ASUS set this up so poorly that we actually went hunting to try and figure out what would be equivalent to their version of a 14900K. The answer is the 13700K for real-world rendering performance in an animation render. The 13700K can be bought for $295 and is performing equivalently to the currently $484 14900K that ASUS is selling you in this computer. Okay, now we are going to have the unfortunate task of tearing this down. I really don't want to take this apart. And the reason is you shouldn't buy it anyway. So we're going to do this as fast as possible. This, of course, is a toolless disassembly, which means we need a tool to get in here. This locking thing does not move at all. It looks like it's supposed to, but I think we need to remove that screw first. Just a Phillips, so this is our first toolless screw. So then now this thing will actually move. So it's like a spring mechanism. This thing has some kick. Okay, so we're gonna remove the sides here. This one looks like it's easy. Yeah. Okay. Again, a pretty heavy duty panel in terms of weight. It has steel, so not a lot of aluminum here. We know when it was stamped at least, which was apparently Christmas Day 2023. Let's just pull up. Yep, that one pulls out. Oh, there you go. This one was made 3 days earlier. December 22nd, 2023. Not super interested in this side. It's like a piece of, it's actually even worse than I thought it would be. I saw it, I thought I would push on it and it would be plexi. I was about to say the word plexi, and it's actually just like, I mean, you can hear the quality. Appears to be a completely proprietary, unnecessarily so format. That's disappointing. There's SODIMMs on it. So we got laptop memory. We have an actual socketable CPU with the laptop memory, some tiny VRM heat sinks on the VRM components, heatsink on an NVMe drive. There's another heatsink down here on the chipset, so that's where the chipset is. And then we've got this sort of daughter board down here that is, let's get a shot sort of down. So if we move these cables, you can see an RGB connector, but then behind it's a PCIe slot. So they've got the board, this main board is socketed into a daughter board, which appears to go over here and offer a PCIe slot for the GPUs. So radiator up top is a unique shape. The radiator is from here. I can kind of go through and grab it to here. So we are actually on the ends of the radiator right now. So it is about a 95 mil width, which is not standard. So for thickness of the hole, what's that say?
27.
All right, so 27. So that's actually pretty standard. So, I mean, they really got pretty close to the smallest possible radiator that could go in this top slot that they've engineered themselves into. They've completely obstructed the front panel. The floor is a joke. So, the hell are they? What are they doing? So the floor, first of all, it's not tall enough. But secondly, you can see the metal mesh in there is like, the holes are so sparingly placed that the holes in the outer shell and the holes in the mesh inside don't always align. So we end up with a really obstructed panel there. And the power, there's a fan down there in the bottom, right there. So that's trying to pull in or through that bottom hole, although there's not much of it. And then the power supply is relying on this rear fan, which appears to be exhaust. And as for where the power supply is getting its air from, the answer is the answer appears to be another dimension. So that's good. This strange cable right here, that's going to the front I/O. So front I/O or top I/O, it's up here, and that's just being fed by the one cable to the board. It feeds into another daughter board that provides the USB and audio headers. And then on the other side of the motherboard, we've got power. There's ATX power here, so that takes place of your 24 pin. And then there's this ATX 12 volt power connector here as well, as labeled on the board. And then they have another power connector over here. For some reason is labeled EATX, which is not a real standard 12 volt. So that's what that's labeled. The labeling is underneath the wireless antenna. So we're gonna pull this screw, which is marked with Sharpie in a few locations. That's interesting. Okay, good. They did not forget to peel the tape on either side. Good work, ASUS. This is interesting to see this silver Sharpie on every screw in this system. They've got them on all these ones on the motherboard too. Let's just check for if the screws are actually tightened all the way. No screw torque problems. So that much they get credit for. Last thing I want to check is under the cooler. So that is a T15. So torque's 15 to get in there. Torque is good on them. I mean, it makes sense. If there's one thing ASUS is good at, it's screwing. So the last thing we're going to look at is the paste quality. All right. That overall looks good. It's interesting to see the protruding copper plate here. This normally works better for a GPU, where typically those protrusions, they tend to do it because you can get them a little flatter and make better contact with direct to die, like silicon solutions. But either way, the coverage looks pretty good. It's like a couple weaker spots down here along the edge and then up here in one spot. But overall, the coverage does look pretty good. So the thing we end up with is the interdimensional hole on the bottom of the case, the solid wall at the front, a little bit of a strange radiator solution, but one that does fit. And unfortunately, a combination of parts that, even though it appears that the cables are managed well, the screws didn't have any torque issues, anything like that, they just screwed up in configuring the actual components in the system. So it's one of those where it's disappointing because it looks like the build itself is overall pretty clean. They've just decided to do this irreplaceable, proprietary, weird motherboard and not off-the-shelf cooler. So yeah, I'm kind of locked into whatever you get from ASUS and however long they want to support it. Those are going to be my biggest problems with this, other than the interdimensional mesh that they've used, which is a technology that I think they stole from Thermaltake circa 2017. So let's get back to the review. Now, despite being purchased in-store at Micro Center and therefore not requiring sturdy packaging, it probably could have been shipped as is without issues. This is one of the few things that was done acceptably. The outer box contains the accessories and 4 foam corners that suspend an inner box with a handle, which levers open and raises up like a pedestal. There's a cardboard and foam sled that holds the PC itself in a fabric bag. This is maybe one of the only things in this whole review where ASUS was able to hit a bar of being acceptable. Moving to accessories, the accessory bundle was super basic. It had a mouse and keyboard that aren't good, wireless antenna, AC power cord, and the extra not tempered glass plexiglass panel. There's also a box of paperwork with an installation guide, a very large don't eat batteries sticker, and panel replacement instructions. And then in what's one of the most basic mistakes, the install guide shows connecting the monitor to the motherboard HDMI port. and it doesn't even have a GPU installed in the drawing, which renders it useless for someone who actually needs help setting up this computer they would have just spent over $2,000 on. This is bad and misleading for a novice user. It's especially weird since even the worst pre-builts we've ever reviewed get this step right, since incorrect display header usage on a motherboard instead of a GPU leads to high support request volume. Replacing the side panel is annoying. First, you remove the tool-free top panel without a single screw by using a tool to remove the single screw under a rubber cover before sliding the side panel up. Then you use two tools for the toolless installation to remove 14 screws from the not a single screw setup. These 14 screws have 3 different varieties with both Phillips 1 and Phillips 0 heads. Installation would be the reverse, leaving the PC with a plain looking and very dark tinted side panel without ventilation. Fortunately, you won't have to complete the installation because you'd be better off taking all the components out and selling them individually at this point. If you didn't have enough reasons to not buy this computer, let's move to BIOS. On first boot, the G22CH restarted twice, so 3 attempts total just to turn it on. This isn't entirely unheard of, but it is strange for a system that runs JEDEC spec memory and doesn't need memory training, and was behaving as if it had never been powered on after install. BIOS version 404 indicates that important Intel microcode updates are not found. Since the build date of November 2023 long predates them, you'd be at risk of Intel's instability problems. We purchased the pre-built PC in August, so based on ASUS' support page, version 408 of the BIOS had been available for around or over 2 months before that. The rest of the BIOS is mundane and lacks any overclocking, power limit, or even memory speed controls. B760 is supposed to have XMP compatibility, so that's inexcusable. These restrictions further reinforce the power-hungry 14900KF as a nonsense choice and relegates the board to e-waste. It at least technically works for now, so it's got that going for it, but otherwise, none of this really makes any sense. One of the only nice things about the BIOS is that the fan headers are labeled well and are fully controllable. So, now we've got 2 reasons to buy this computer. One is if you want a nice set of cardboard boxes and packing materials, and the second one is if you like fan header labeling. The OS setup also had problems. There's an ASUS registration prompt at the end of the Windows 11 out-of-box experience, and user information will be shared with McAfee by default unless you uncheck a box, presumably so they can try to figure out how to make their software even worse. They've been doing it for decades now. It must get hard. Upon finally hitting the desktop, we were greeted with a suitably cool and edgy neon Republic of Gamers wallpaper. There weren't any pop-ups, but the start menu had the full complement of ASUS Bloat, My ASUS, Armory Crate, Aura Creator, and McAfee, which was the only one actively running in the tray, and also the worst. Overall, it's basically set up just like a laptop that sucks. It just happens to be a desktop that sucks. The pre-installed NVIDIA GPU driver was from June of 2023, which is 14 months out of date at the time of purchasing the computer. That is absurdly old and lacks over a year of various feature updates, game compatibility fixes, and optimizations. Even if this thing sat on a shelf for months, it would still be old. This would lead to problems for the user if they didn't get a forced update or know to do one themselves. With the amateur hour software setup out of the way, back to the charts. This chart has thermal results for both the stock mesh side panel and the solid plexiglass. Generally speaking, the system managed to keep itself cool because it's underclocking itself into oblivion. And by that, we mean into frequencies that were common on processors when The Elder Scrolls Oblivion launched.
Stop right there, criminal scum!
Given that restriction, Imperial Guard notwithstanding, CPU P-core average temperature peaked at 68 to 69 degrees Celsius with the solid panel installed. Sticking with the stock mesh panel gave us roughly a 1 degree lower temperature across both the CPU and the SSD. ASUS could have safely allowed a moderately higher power limit given the 20 or so degrees of headroom here. It's possible that the motherboard VRM is also a limiting factor, though. Interestingly, the solid side panel gave a very slightly but insignificant advantage to GPU thermals. It's likely that increasing the resistance to flow on the CPU side of the case forced more air to be drawn from the GPU chamber, therefore removing the hot GPU exhaust faster. Memory SPD hub temperatures showed the same favor, which is something we've seen before in ITX case reviews when airflow paths are such that the air is forced to flow directly over the RAM. We also brought the system into our hemianechoic chamber for acoustic analysis. We built this chamber last year with the help from you all in our audience who've supported us via patreon.com/gamersnexus and store.gamersnexus.net. It's those of you who support us who've allowed us to get heavy use out of this chamber since its construction. We're using it in almost every review of these now. Thanks for your support. The system operated in somewhat of a stair-step pattern for its fan control. You can see these relatively quick changes at roughly 375 and 700 seconds into the test. Noise levels settled in around 31.9 dBA at steady state thermals. We weren't able to see how the fans would behave under an actual heavy load because of the aforementioned CPU power limit. Even though these noise levels aren't bad purely by the dBA number, the reason we got the chamber is actually to illustrate what we're going to show you next, which is that the quality of the noise is just bad. Our noise sample exhibits an annoying low hum at idle, and we know it's from the system because we're eliminating all other noises with the chamber. The hum sort of reminds us of a mini fridge. Take a listen. The ASUS G22CH-DH978, that was genuine, I forgot the name, you can't blame me, is not remotely worth buying. It is not worth considering buying. I bought it at Micro Center for $2,500. It is sometimes more than that online. And the reason was, walked by and went, this looks cool. There's a lot of ventilation on it. Maybe it doesn't suck. It does. In between being a system that sounds like a mini fridge but cools like a microwave, and all of the problems with the custom SFF arrangement that's not special enough to warrant the cost based on the cool factor alone, it's just not something we could ever find a way to recommend. ASUS should not be offering a flagship CPU if it's just gonna chop it off at the knees. It's like the same thing we ran into with the i500 and the Origin system. The Origin one was just misconfigured. It was an accident, which is embarrassing. This one is intentionally downclocked. And it's similar in that way to the i500, which we eviscerated in our review of it because it didn't make any sense. You're buying stuff that's performing equivalent to a lower spec part. Again, this is a 13700K that you were paying twice the price of a 13700K for, especially after factoring in whatever margin ASUS is throwing on top of it. The whole thing's insane. It doesn't make any sense. It's a terrible configuration, and it is completely incompetent as a build config. So, being wasteful and passing the expense to the customer for no benefit aside, ASUS added insult to injury by including a motherboard that should have just been standardized to ITX or Micro ATX. The retail listing on the Micro Center website called it tempered glass, but it's plastic. The dimensions were wrong. There's just a lot of things here that they don't need to be this bad, but they are. It's like they didn't care when they put this all together. Now, we don't hate the basic idea. If you look at the system, it's very compact. The sandwich layout is kind of cool. The liquid cooling has proven a successful archetype in a sandwich layout ITX system, as evidenced by cases like the Fractal Era 2, the A4H2O, and plenty of others. It's a system that can work. The custom-sized liquid cooler is capable of dissipating at least 125 watts with about 20 degrees Celsius of headroom without getting too loud. So it could probably handle a 13600K. And that's without downclocking it intentionally. Now, an AMD X3D CPU would have been the obvious choice. It would kill it in this form factor, really low power, definitely can be cooled by this without the huge sacrifices that ASUS is making to try and stay in bed with Intel for whatever reason they've chosen to do that. But even if they want to stay with Intel, they can do that in a way that isn't just robbing the user of performance. All that said, even still, the price is just too high. In the small form factor market, yes, sometimes you have to pay more than you typically would just to get something put together, at least versus ATX. But in this situation, it's far too much for far too little. So ASUS, congratulations. This is genuinely the worst pre-built we have ever reviewed at this point. The dropping 1300 megahertz is something that nobody else has managed to do in our testing. 1000 megahertz in the Origin one on AMD, that was impressive, but this is even better. So we're impressed. It's just not for the right reasons. That's it for this one. As always, thanks for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly. We buy these pre-builts so we can review them and give you an unbiased look without the manufacturer even knowing about it, at least as much as we can control. And so that's your review of this one. Check out the Thermal Take one if you want to see something actually good, and we'll go back to hunting for things that are actually good because we've had a lot of bad ones, and it felt nice reviewing one that didn't suck. So hopefully we can find another one. Check back for that. Subscribe. Go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. We'll see you all next time.